Today we are used to think of the Western as an American genre, as the American genre in fact. The full-length frontier novel of the 19th century, surprisingly, was dominated rather by European than American writers, given that whoever used to call himself or herself American back then was an immigrant to begin with. The distinction was kind of vague anyway. In the 19th century, Wild West novelists could be Germans like Balduin Mölllhausen and Friedrich Gerstäcker, Frenchmen like Gustave Aimard and Gabriel Ferry, Scots like Thomas Mayne Wright, or Austrians like Charles Sealsfield. Their legitimacy was not affected by their nationality, and their forgotten tales of the West are what I would like to tell you something about. This time I'd like to examine not a novel, but 3 novellas about the Wild West. 2 of those frontier novellas have been written by the German author Friedrich Gerstäcker, who traveled North and South America, Australia and many other places in the first half of the 19th century. The last novella has been written by the younger author Karl-May. Direct comparison of these 3 novellas will tell us how important Gerstaecker was both as a source and as inspiration for his younger colleague. Let's hear about their lives first. Friedrich Gerstäecker was born 1816 at Hamburg. His parents were opera singers. His father sang the title part during the first Dresdner performance of the famous opera The Fatal Marksman, in German Der Freischütz, by Carl Maria von Weber. Also, Gerstaecker's parents, their professional names being Monsieur Gerstaecker and Mademoiselle Herz, were personally acquainted with the great fantastic writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, who was also their conductor at Leipzig. Hoffmann would also write very harsh criticism about Monsieur Gerstaecker, which actually is a very good sign, because Hoffmann panned only artists he actually cared about, and he obviously cared a great deal about his first and best lyrical tenor. His son, young Friedrich, was heavily inspired by Hoffmann, writing not only about foreign countries or the Wild West, but also a great number of fantastic stories, similar to Hoffmann, the German master of fantastic literature. Inspired by reading the works of James Fenimore Cooper, young Friedrich made his first journey to North America when he was 20 years old. Mostly by foot, he traveled Canada, Texas, and Louisiana and stayed for several years in Arkansas, near the Fourche de la Fave River. Living by hunting, he became very fond of the backward people of Arkansas. His love for the people of Arkansas is present in many of his writings. Many of his characters are based on actual, real-life persons. Even though he lived by the hunt for several years, he never planned to grow an existence this way. He used to say, "If the deer is too easy to get, then it isn't worth anything. And if it is worth something, then it is too hard to get." To inform his then widowed mother about what he was doing, he wrote an extensive diary, which he then sent to his mother, the former Mademoiselle Herz. Having returned to Germany after 6 years of traveling, he realized he had already become a household name. His mother had published his highly entertaining diary in a journal. A collected book version of it became his first success as a writer. After working as a translator of English novels into German, among others of Herman Melville, he published his first novel at 1846, The Regulators of Arkansas, followed by his most successful novel, The River Pirates of the Mississippi, in 1847. He came to enjoy the relative independence of being an author. After the failed German Revolution in 1848, however, he had taken part in the revolution as a member of a sharpshooters company in Leipzig. Gerstaecker had some trouble to find a solvent publisher and began traveling again. From now on, he changed from traveling to writing and writing to traveling. He visited South America, California, Tahiti, Australia, and Egypt. His most well-known novella is probably 1860's Germelshausen, a fantastic story set in then-contemporary Germany. It is about a secluded mountain town magically stuck in the Middle Ages, which only once within 100 years surfaces to be visited by some unsuspecting traveler. The novella has been adapted as the musical and film Brigadoon, but since during the time of production the USA were at war with Germany, the producers decided to relocate the story from Germany to the Scottish Highlands and deny Gerstacker's authorship. Gerstaecker was married twice and had several children. His first wife had died while he was away. His last big journey led him from, again, North America over Mexico to the West Indies and Venezuela. He died 1872 at Brunswick or Braunschweig, shortly after having published a collected edition with 44 volumes of novels and novellas. He was 56 years old. His last novels and novellas were about Mexico and the USA during the troubled period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And it is exactly this historic period where also the great majority of the younger Karl-May's frontier novels and novellas are set. Karl-May was born in 1842 into an impoverished 16-head family in Saxony. His mother was a midwife, his father was a weaver with political ambitions, which his son did not inherit. He was the only surviving son. Being extraordinarily gifted, Karl-May was allowed to study to hopefully become a teacher and be able to support his family. Instead, he was jailed for property torts so petty they would hardly be considered misdemeanors by today's standards. In 1861, however, they caused his teaching license to be permanently revoked. Not being able to support himself, he committed minor felonies, such as impersonating policemen, doctors, or plantation owners, and spinning fantastic tales as a matter of fraud. He ended up serving 8 years of prison. During his incarceration, he worked, among other things, as the prison's librarian, spending much time reading. When asked what he wanted to do after prison time, he said he might migrate to America and or become a writer. By that time, he might already have come in touch with the writings of Friedrich Gerstäcker. He was released 1874 at the age of 32, 2 years after Gerstacker's death. He then worked as an editor. In 1878, he became a freelance writer. His first stories about the American frontier were published in 1875, including the novella we will talk about today. Let's return to Gerstaecker. The first novella we are going to talk about has been published in Gerstacker's collected volume, Mississippi Bilder, Images from the Mississippi, The Light and the Downsides of Transatlantic Life, from 1848. It is a brilliant book because of the many different types of texts to be found there. There are funny stories and tragic ones, detailed descriptions both of cities, country, judiciary, and of backwood life. Gerstaecker was made an honorary citizen of Arkansas in 1957, and the 10th of May was made Gerstaecker Day by the governor in 1986. It was well earned. There is a brilliant little story about the presidential election of 1844 and the campaigning of the Whig Party, which 16 years later went the way of the Whigs and ceased to exist. It should be mandatory reading, I believe, particularly for Republicans. There are also touching stories, such as Hunter Stephen and his dog Puppy, which is based on real-life experience and expresses the actual love Gerstaecker had for the backward people of Arkansas. I would like to talk about the story Der Osage, in English The Osage or The Osage Warrior. It begins with a young white hunter in the west of Missouri, close to the Osage territory. At this particular day, the frustrated young man's hunt is unsuccessful until he comes across a deer, which has already been wounded by buckshot. Since the young man gives the deer its final shot, he considers the prey to be rightfully his. This is when the title character enters the story. By his war paint and many scars on his breast and shoulders, the young man considers the stranger to be an Osage warrior. Because of the buckshot wound, the native considers the animal's skin to be his, leaving only the venison to the white man. When the young man returns to his uncle's trading post, he is very surprised to meet the Osage native again. The Osage calls himself Tom and tries to exchange his animal skins and some raw meat for, and I quote, some gunpowder, some lead, some knife, some tobacco, and much whiskey. End of quote. Now the trader claims to be forbidden to sell any alcohol to any Injun, to which Tom replies, and I quote, I, good Injun. I love white men. I do everything for white men. I go to church. I very good Injun. But the trader continues to tease him. Don't you know that a good Injun does not touch whiskey? I no good Injun, the native replies. I'm a damned scoundrel, which causes the trader to laugh and no longer refuse to make the trade. His nephew, however, still considers the native to have stolen his prey, and decides to pull a prank on him. He secretly takes the native's rifle, pulls out the graft, and lets the buckshot trickle into his hand. He then puts back the rifle as it was, and bets $1 that Tom has had too much whiskey already to hit even one of his uncle's turkeys. His uncle at first tries to prevent Tom from shooting his chicken, but once his nephew has given him a sign, he agrees, seeing no harm in taking a drunken native for a ride. Tom takes the shot, but because the buckshot has been removed, no turkey is harmed. Tom has lost one hard-earned $1, and with the words, Tom too much whiskey, whiskey no good, he disappears into the woods. Some 14 days later, the three men meet again at the uncle's trading post to exchange goods, and the young hunter proposes to raise the stakes. $5, the native won't hit another turkey. Tom refuses, claiming to play only for whiskey, not for money. Injun love firewater, but where whiteface come, otters go away. Injun too, Injun poor. But when the nephew implies Tom must have already had too much whiskey this day, Tom reluctantly agrees to the bet to prove he is sober. Of course, the nephew has already taken out the buckshot. Tom shoots, but when the dust settles, the two white men are surprised to find 4 turkeys shot dead, and they have lost $5. Now the uncle, angry at being on the receiving end of the prank, tries to challenge Tom's win. Tom throws just one glance at him, and I quote, "But in that one glance lay, quite contrary to the character the native had shown so far, such a lava flow of fury, hate, and revenge, the horrified trader took one step back and let the Osage go in peace." Just 1 second later, the pleasant old smile shone out of the native's eyes again. End of quote. Just before he goes, Tom gives the young hunter a wink. If I come to white face, always 2 loads of buckshot in rifle. If white men pull out 1, another still left to go. Goodbye. So far the summary of Gerstacker's novella, The Osage. Friedrich Gerstäcker always claimed to be a pupil of James Fenimore Cooper, but in none of Cooper's novels you will find a character such as the Osage Tom. There is no romance here. Tom is no noble savage. Neither is he master of his fate. White men would hardly consider him a footnote in the heroic history of the self-proclaimed American pioneer. He is an alcoholic, he is the victim of prank, ridicule, and actual fraud. Gerstaecker does not sugarcoat. He shows the bleak reality of how the natives were seen by the white intruder. The name of Tom suggests that he has already kind of given up on his former native identity. Now he is whatever white men want him to be, and he agrees to be either a bad Injun or a good Injun as long as it helps him getting his booze. Tom knows the images every white man has in his head. He does not challenge these images, but instead tries to use them to his own advantage. In the American Western, I seldom find native characters changing so completely from ridiculous drunkard to scalping Injun on a warpath back and again within the blink of an eye. I've seen it only once in the Western, James Cukier's The Lady and the Killer, where the seemingly funny scene turns deadly within the matter of a second. But the scene Gerstaecker describes is different, because it takes place almost completely inside the white man's head. He comes as a harmless drunkard, because this is how the white immigrants see him. And when they see him as a scalping red devil on a warpath, it's hardly because of anything he has done. He only looks at them. It's because of what they have done to him and his people. The scalping red devil is a creation of their own bad conscience. He knows that and very probably uses their racist stereotypes against them. It is an empty triumph, though. It does not change much for him or for his tribe. It does not give him a lot of agency. Gerstaecker had met real Native Americans. His descriptions are based on actual experience, not fantasy. 1868's novella In the Prairie features as the main protagonist the historic Cheyenne chief Turkey Leg. Gerstaecker had met him in person. The novella In the Prairie retells the actual so-called Plum Creek incident in 1864, in which Turkey Leg and his young band derailed a Union Pacific train and killed several crew members. One white railroader escaped after the Cheyenne scalped him and became one of the few cases on record of a person surviving without his scalp. Friedrich Gerstäcker begins his story with a description of the prairie and the railway running through it. Then he changes inside the train to let the reader witness the railroaders discussing the possibility of being raided by hostile natives. One of the railroaders takes the side of the natives, insisting that they have some reason to be angry, since they have been cheated out of their former homeland, only to now be screwed over by corrupt Indian agents. But the Indians are getting provisions for free, so why shouldn't the white agents get rich in the process too? The natives' defender finds this a hard point to argue against. Meanwhile, the band of Turkey Leg prepares to loosen the railway and to derail the train, and to lead it from the trackbed right into the prairie. Here, Friedrich Gerstäecker takes some creative license. He lets a white bandit called Kaibola show them how it is done most efficiently. According to D. Brown, the idea of directing the railway into the prairie came from the Cheyenne chief Sleeping Rabbit. You may find it insulting that Gerstaecker thought they needed a white man's help to finish the job. But Gerstaecker uses this poetic license to illustrate some higher truth. The white people the indigenous tribes had most contact with weren't necessarily the most friendly, reliable, or trustworthy kind, particularly since they thought the indigenous people beneath themselves. They could be squatters, prospectors, poachers, frauds, Indian agents, some of them corrupt, many just being eager to make a quick buck while not caring a lot who they hurt in order to achieve a short-term gain. Except for the introduction of Kaibola, Gerstaecker follows the actual events of the Plum Creek incident very closely. He does not spare his readers the gory details of all railroaders except for 2 survivors being scalped and killed after the train has been derailed. After the battle, Turkey Leg orders 2 of his warriors to carry the captured cloth and provisions home to their camp, while the few captured weapons are brought to their brothers in arms. Even though the white traitor Kaibola has already been rewarded substantially, he decides to take cloth and provisions for himself too, and murders the 2 warriors by shooting them in the back. Turkey Leg comes too late to save his men, but after a swift ride, which almost kills his horse, he at least manages to hunt down and kill the treacherous Bola. The text ends with reference of the Peace Council at the North Platte River, which is where Friedrich Gerstäcker met and smoked the peace pipe with Turkey Leg. Gerstaecker described the Cheyenne chief with great detail and expressed his sorrow about Turkey Leg having started to raid white settlements and trains again. I quote, "Poor deluded people. From the moment they took up their tomahawk again, the campaign of their own destruction has started, and their fate, now inescapable, is all too easy to foresee." End of quote. Obviously, Gerstaecker did not foresee the battle at Little Bighorn, in which Turkey Leg played a substantial and victorious part. This particular story of Friedrich Gerstäecker would inspire at least 3 different stories by the 36 years younger Karl-May. 1882 he published In the Wild West of Northern America. Here, the protagonist, Old Shatterhand, investigates a train robbery, which follows exactly the model of Gerstaecker's real-life story. The only difference, there are no survivors, and the train is raided not by Cheyenne, but by a tribe which Gerstaecker has already described as their sometime allies, the Sioux. Like in Gerstaecker's story, the Sioux are working together with some white bandits, though there is little trust between them. Karl-May even invented a nickname for the gang, the Rail Troublers. Other stories inspired by Gerstaecker's are Karl-May's very first Winnetou story, the 1875 version of Old Firehand, and 1880's Deadly Dust. Here, the respective protagonists are able to prevent similar raids from being successful. Now, let's examine Karl-May's very first known Wild West story, 1875's Inn-nu-woh, the Indian Chief, and let's establish where the young Karl-May and Friedrich Gerstäecker are similar and where they differ. 1875's Inn-nu-woh exists in 3 different versions. The first, from 1875, goes by the full title of Inn-nu-woh, the Indian Chief. The second version, from 1878, is called Winnetou, a travel experience by Karl-May. The third version has been substantially extended and rewritten. It is the first chapter of 1890's The Treasure of the Silver Lake, Karl-May's best-selling novel. We are leaving this version aside for now and concentrate on the first 2. The story is set in New Orleans, Louisiana, during an epidemic of the yellow fever, or as Karl-May calls it, the Yellow Jack. We are never given any date or any hint if it is supposed to be any historical epidemic, such as 1853, 1867, or 1870. There is no reference to the incident taking place before or after the Civil War either. Gerstaecker wrote a long description of the city of New Orleans before the Civil War. It was published in the already mentioned collection Images from the Mississippi, and Karl-May follows this description so closely you might be tempted to suggest his story to be just another one of Gerstaecker's. As you progress, you are going to realize there is something very different here. First of all, the story is told from the viewpoint of a first-person narrator. Its first version has been featured under the collective title From the Files of a Well-Traveled Man, leaving it relatively open for the reader to decide if this well-traveled narrator was actually Karl-May or some fictional persona modeled after the image of Friedrich Gerstäecker. Only in the later version, Winnetou of 1878, May calls it a travel experience by himself. Friedrich Gerstäecker had no need in writing himself into the story to convince his readers he was writing from experience. Anyone knew he was a well-traveled man with no need to pretend. So he seldom wrote himself into the story, if the story itself wasn't actually about him. The aforementioned In the Prairie is an exception, not the rule. Since New Orleans is haunted by the yellow fever, The narrator finds himself surrounded by people trying like himself to leave the city by any transportation available. When he has finally booked transportation on a packet vessel, the black man Ned, being the factotum of the hotel, directs the narrator's interest towards the strange figure of a native chief, identifying him as Inn-nu-woh, who is a Sioux chief and supposed to be the best swimmer of the whole West. In the 1878 version, the native is called Winnetou. He is a chief of the Apache and is given some additional background. He is already about 50 years old. He is returning from a visit with the White Father, the president, and his many adventures are already the talk of the town. When an open coach directed to the same vessel tries to pass him by, a braided coachman called Jim bawls at him to make way. This request is both rude and unnecessary, since there is a lot of space to drive around him. So the native decides to just ignore it. Bellowing, "Make way," he now uses the N-word. The coach driver flogs the chief's face with his whip. At once, the native has struck the driver's face and thrown him off his seat and onto the ground. Now, the coach's owner, a Yankee, steps in, pointing his gun at the chief, threatening to shoot him if his driver isn't back on his seat in an instant. Not before being advised by the bystanders that the Injun had been provoked, the Yankee decides to let him go for now. In the first version, the rich coach owner is called the Yankee. On the other hand, in this story, Mike calls almost every white person on the packet vessel a Yankee. In the second version, the owner calls himself Colonel Webster. Since the vessel has originally not been intended for passenger transportation, the passengers have to take their seat amidst the cargo. The cargo contains, among other things, the cages and the animals of a well-equipped menagerie, property of famous animal tamer Fourche, with whom the narrator is already acquainted. The rich Yankee Colonel Webster challenges Fourche's claim to frequently enter the dangerous animal's cage. Here on the ship, he wouldn't dare to do it. To the great displeasure of Mr. Fourche, the native chief has already taken his seat on top of his lion's cage. Of course, the animal tamer denies being any less courageous than the native. Mr. Webster, on the other hand, takes the native's apparent courage as nothing but ignorance and stupidity. You could let the porcupine out of its cage over there, and the Injun would jump right into the river for fear. Those Canays are as timid as they're cruel. They possess neither spirit nor emotion, neither reason nor soul. They're Injun, not human. End of quote. Finally, and with the reluctant approval of the captain, Mr. Fourche agrees on a bet to enter the cage of his wild tigress. But this time, the tigress surprises her tamer. In the 1878 version, the female predator pushes her owner out of the cage and into the crowd of screaming passengers. In the 1875 version, she bites off one of his arms. But even in this version, Mr. Fourche fares better than his counterpart in the first chapter of 1890's The Treasure of the Silver Lake. Here, the wild animal is a black panther, and it bites off his head. In any versions, the dangerous carnivore is now running free on the deck and threatens to kill the Yankee Colonel Webster's pale daughter. But the innocent girl is saved by the native, who, fast like a cat, grabs her around the waist and jumps off with her into the river. While the captain orders the vessel to stop, the tigress jumps after them. But the native manages to save himself and the girl by diving under the boat and climb aboard again on the other side, before the crocodiles can get to them. Much to the displeasure of the wounded Mr. Fourche, the crocodiles take care of the tigress as well. As Mr. Webster timidly approaches the native to show him his appreciation and gratitude, the chief boldly replies the words, "The white man is wrong. The red men have neither courage nor heart. They're not human." Winnetou did not care to save the young squaw. He just jumped into the Holy Father of the Rivers because he was afraid of the porcupine the white man had set loose, and leaves him. Now, the 1878 version, Winnetou, ends with an epilogue that is missing in his first version, Inn-nu-woh, but it is important to know. I quote, "For a long time, we could see his rich, mane-like hair blowing in the wind. Even longer the sound of his voice kept resonating in our ear. But the longest we thought about his gallantry of paying the colonel's contempt with goodness. I had no idea I would soon meet him again, and yet I would later cross the whole prairie by his side. I owe him my life 10 times over. I have to tell you of countless adventures that would have been my last if not for him. I call him the best, the most faithful, and the noblest of my friends. And if there is talk about a man deserving the name of hero, I cannot otherwise. I always have to think of Winnetou, the chief of the Apache." End of quote. In the center of every story we have heard so far, a Native American is the main protagonist. They have that in common, and more. However, in the stories of Friedrich Gerstäcker, there is a sense of reality we do not get from Karl-May. What Friedrich Gerstäcker gives us is either a real historic incident, or at least there's a real background to it. Karl-May's story also begins in a real historic setting based on a real-life situation. However, the fever epidemic just works as some sort of excuse for bringing the main elements of the story together. The crowded packet vessel, the big-headed Yankee colonel and his daughter, the noble chief, the narrator, the animal tamer and his tigress. Once the protagonists are gathered, pure imagination creates a narrative full of action, suspense, and amazing heroics. Winnetou, or Inn-nu-woh, isn't just an average hero. Very much like Gerstacker's Osage Tom, the native chief is treated with contempt. He is ridiculed and made fun about by some of the present white men. On the other hand, it is very clear from the beginning that for other people, this native chief isn't an ordinary man. Some of his heroics are the talk of the town even before the actual story begins, and the black man Ned introduces him not just as a good swimmer, but as the best swimmer in the whole West. And so he is introduced as a hero with qualities to put other heroes to shame, making him not just heroic, but super heroic. From the beginning, and very much unlike the Osage Tom, he makes it very clear he is not going to be victimized. In the climax, he is the one who does the near impossible, diving into a river full of crocodiles, out swimming and out diving a healthy and furious tigress while saving a damsel in distress isn't just near impossible. The fact the animal tamer Mr. Forster is described as a capable professional makes the native putting him to shame even more amazing. When the native denies taking any advantage of or accepting any gratitude for his heroics, when it turns out that he has saved the damsel in distress without question just because he could, and probably because with great power comes great responsibility and everything, then we have definitely entered the realm of superheroes. But the story does not end there. Now, Gerstacker's story in the plains begins with a real-life situation, then tells the actual incident with some poetic license, then turns back to reality and ends there with the narrator Gerstaecker meeting his protagonist Turkey Leg. The narrator of Winnetou jumping off from a real-life situation into superheroic fantasy does not end his story with himself just meeting his protagonist. Instead, the narrator, a mere bystander until now, becomes his trusted ally and friend. He becomes a hero worthy of his superhero, a hero worthy to be saved, meaning that he has become a superhero himself. This is the legend of Karl-May's recurring hero Old Shatterhand in a nutshell. But the amazing thing is that there is nothing to indicate as to how and why the narrator should become a superhero, and what exactly distinguishes him from his readers to become said superhero. And here's the trick. There is nothing that distinguishes the narrator from the reader. Even in his more fleshed out form, Karl-May's first-person narrator, called Old Shatterhand, is indistinguishable from his reader. There's nothing about him that does not seem average. Instead, even his clothes are always in tip-top shape, and all people take him for a would-be sportsman because he looks like he's coming fresh from the store. Actually, Old Shatterhand is a nerd. And when he comes to the Wild West, he gets on his tutor's nerves, because anything the actual frontiersman Sam Hawkins intends to teach him, he has already read somewhere. Now, what do all Karl-May readers have in common? They read. That's the hidden promise of Karl-May's prose. Keep reading, and you can become a superhero yourself. The secret of the character Old Shatterhand's success lies in the fact that, just like Spider-Man, just like Superman, he is two things at once: Superman and Clark Kent. The superhero and the average spitting image of his reader, which he wears just like Superman wears his secret identity. Karl-May turns Gerstaecker's real-life Wild West into a realm of pure escapism, where he and his readers can become a superhero with all recognition and agency that actual life denies them. There is no shame in that. Even though it is a shame that Friedrich Gerstäcker is hardly getting the recognition he deserves, it is obvious that Karl-May has created something Gerstaecker would not have been able or even care to create. One of Gerstaecker's texts is titled "How Is It Really in America?" This title stands for his work as a whole, understanding itself as his ongoing battle against every kind of romantic illusion, of any illusion, be it social, political, or scientific illusion, be it the illusion of turkey leg, to undo what the Iron Horse has done to his people, or the illusion of two white men to be able to pull the same prank twice on a native. Gerstaecker described real-life people. The aforementioned story about the trapper Stephen and his dog Puppy is so real to me, it brings me to actual tears every single time I read it. But when I'm finished, I feel like their story has been told to me, and there is nothing left that I would still like to know. Would I really like to keep witnessing the Osage Tom, probably as an alcoholic? Wouldn't I much rather content myself with one victory he has achieved? Gerstaecker's writings are full of amazing and highly entertaining characters. Indeed, even a single novel, such as The Regulators of Arkansas or The Pirates of the Mississippi, contains so many of them, the novel itself doesn't actually seem to care which character to focus on, which is also why I prefer his novellas to his novels. Perhaps the main character is none of the characters, but rather the people itself, like the people of Arkansas, whom Gerstaecker loved so much. Yet once he has told their story, I find no character left whom I would like to read more about, and whom I would be looking forward to meet again and again and again, like I would Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, or Spider-Man. That's what Winnetou does, and that's what Old Shatterhand does to his readers. And just for that, it seems to me that the recognition Karl-May is still getting just might be very well deserved. Furthermore, I do think where Gerstaecker fails is to grant his native protagonists any actual agency. Some manage to exert some sort of personal revenge with the white people who most wronged them before. Another supportive character manages to steal back the remains of his father and give them a proper burial instead of being part of a public exhibition. Besides such small, if important, victories, Gerstaecker grants very little agency to his native characters. Karl-May's native characters have a lot of agency. Winnetou has a lot of agency. And this may be the reason why Karl-May's stories, despite being escapist fantasy, seem in fact less racist than the more realistic and probably very well-meaning Gerstaecker. I will not hold it against you should you choose to reject both. It's reasonable enough, but some part of me will probably not stop respecting what they tried to do, and I am finished talking neither about them nor where I think they failed and where I think they may have succeeded. Next time, I am going to talk about another German Wild West author, Balduin Mölllhausen.